My name is Naomi Achibe Ferris, and at 9:42 on a Tuesday night, my phone buzzed with a notification from the Ferris family group chat. 31 members, including my mother-in-law, my husband's 4 siblings, 3 aunts, and mortifyingly, my own father, who my husband had added years earlier out of politeness after our wedding. The notification was an audio file, 11 minutes and 18 seconds long, titled, "With the specific carelessness of someone who'd recorded it while pacing around her own kitchen. Voice message, .m4a." I almost didn't open it right away. I'm grateful in hindsight that I did, because that recording was my sister-in-law, Vanessa, unmistakably, in her own voice, spending 11 full minutes telling her actual sister exactly what she thought of me, my parenting, my marriage, my fake niceness, and near the end, a specific claim that would end up mattering more than any of the rest that she'd been quietly telling Mom for years, that I was turning her son against the family. She'd meant to send it to her sister Priscilla in their private thread. She sent it instead to 31 people, including me, and including her own mother, who, it would turn out, had absolutely no idea any of this had ever actually been said to her. Welcome back to True Family Drama, the channel for real stories of betrayal, justice, and the specific chaos that happens when someone's private cruelty gets accidentally broadcast to the entire audience they were hiding it from. This one's got a little more dark comedy in it than most of what you'll find on this channel, mixed in with some genuinely painful family reckoning, so stay with me through this. Because the fallout from that single misdirected voice memo ended up changing more in my husband's family than I ever could have engineered on my own, even if I'd wanted to. If you're new here, subscribe, because there's a lot more like this waiting for you. To understand why that voice memo detonated the way it did, you have to understand Vanessa first, and you have to understand the specific quiet campaign she'd apparently been running against me for years, one I had almost no idea existed until her own carelessness finally exposed it. I married my husband, Theo Ferris, 6 years ago, marrying into a large, close-knit family, 5 siblings total, a mother, Diane, who I'd always found warm if occasionally overwhelming, and an extended web of aunts, cousins, and family friends who all seemed to exist in a state of near constant communication through that same sprawling group chat. I want to describe what marrying into that family actually felt like in the early years, because I think the contrast between my genuine, hopeful effort to belong and what the recording eventually revealed makes this story land harder than if I'd simply been a distant, uninvolved daughter-in-law from the start. I came from a small family myself, just my father and me since my mother passed when I was in college, and the sheer size and noise of the Ferris family felt, in those first years, like something I actively wanted to earn my place inside of, rather than something I approached with any wariness. I learned every sibling's coffee order before I'd been dating Theo a full year. I started organizing the family's annual summer reunion logistics in my second year of marriage, a task nobody had specifically assigned me, but that I'd noticed nobody else particularly wanted to handle, and that I continued doing, without complaint, for 4 years running. I remembered birthdays, brought homemade dishes to every gathering, and generally operated, for 6 years, under the sincere belief that consistent effort and genuine warmth would eventually be recognized and returned in kind by everyone in that extended family, Vanessa included. Vanessa, Theo's older sister by 4 years, had been polite to me from the beginning in a way I'd always found slightly formal, never quite warm, but nothing that struck me over 6 years as anything more than a personality mismatch between two women who simply weren't destined to become close friends. I want to be honest that I never once suspected, over those 6 years, that formality concealed anything more calculated than simple personal distance. What that 11-minute recording revealed, in devastating detail, was that Vanessa had been engaged in a considerably more active project than simple distance. I want to walk through several more of the specific claims from that recording in more detail, because their sheer accumulated volume, more than any single grievance, is what made the recording feel less like an outburst of frustration and more like a rehearsed, long cultivated case file. She described a Christmas from 4 years earlier when I'd politely declined hosting duties due to a family emergency on my own father's side, reframing my absence, to Priscilla, as evidence that I only show up when it benefits me. She brought up a comment I'd made in passing over a year earlier about wanting to eventually move closer to my own father as he aged, twisting it into proof that I was always planning an exit from the family, never truly committed the way a real daughter-in-law would be. She even brought up my cooking, at one point, with a specificity that struck me as almost absurd in its pettiness, critiquing a dish I'd brought to a family gathering 2 years prior as trying too hard, a phrase she used throughout the recording as something close to a recurring theme, applying it to nearly everything about me, from my parenting choices to the way I decorated for holidays. She described to her sister Priscilla specific incidents from years earlier that I'd genuinely forgotten, reframed in ways that made ordinary moments sound sinister. A disagreement about holiday hosting duties from 3 years prior, recast as evidence that I always find a way to make everything about what I want. A comment I'd made, gently, about wanting Theo to spend more one-on-one time with his own father before his father's health declined further, reframed as me trying to isolate him from the family. And, most damaging of all, a claim, stated matter-of-factly partway through the recording, that Vanessa had been telling Mom for years, quietly, that Naomi doesn't actually like this family, she's just good at performing like she does. I want to describe the specific experience of listening to that recording for the first time, because I think it matters to understanding everything that followed. I was sitting in my kitchen, Theo out at a work dinner, and I remember the strange, dissociated quality of hearing my own sister-in-law's voice describing a version of me I genuinely didn't recognize, constructed from years of small moments I'd never once suspected were being cataloged and reinterpreted against me. I didn't cry immediately. I felt mostly a kind of stunned disbelief, replaying in my head years of holiday dinners and birthday parties where I genuinely believed Vanessa's coolness toward me was simply a personality difference, never once suspecting it was the visible surface of something considerably more deliberate happening underneath. I want to walk you through what happened over the following 2 hours, because the group chat itself became a genuinely strange, almost surreal document of a family collectively reacting, in real time, to a betrayal none of them had expected to witness. I want to describe the specific texture of watching that group chat unfold in real time, because I've genuinely never experienced anything quite like it before or since. Notifications arrived in waves, overlapping, some people clearly listening in real time and reacting mid-recording, others catching up minutes later and reacting to context they'd missed. My cousin-in-law, Bethany, sent a single devastating voice-to-text typo that read, "I can't believe what I'm hearing, Ren," followed immediately by 3 separate crying laughing emojis that she quickly deleted once she apparently realized the gravity of what was actually happening rather than something merely embarrassing. An uncle by marriage, clearly confused about the platform entirely, attempted to leave the group chat and instead accidentally sent a photo of his own dog, a mistake that, in any other context, might have been the most chaotic message of the night, but that barely registered against everything else unfolding around it. The first responses, arriving within minutes, were confused. A cousin asking, "Wrong chat?" An aunt simply sending a string of question marks. Then gradually, as more people actually listened to the full 11 minutes, rather than assuming it was some kind of accidental partial upload, the tenor shifted. I want to describe a few of the specific reactions from Theo's siblings, because their differing responses ended up mattering considerably to how the family eventually processed everything. His younger brother Marcus, no relation to the Marcus from an earlier story on this channel, apparently another popular name in my orbit, responded almost immediately with unambiguous support, sending a message directly to me privately within minutes that simply read, "That was not okay." I've never heard any of that from her before, and I don't believe a word of it. I'm sorry you had to find out like this. His youngest sister, Priya, took longer to respond, publicly at least, though she later told me she'd spent those first 20 minutes replaying old memories of her own interactions with Vanessa, trying to determine whether she herself had ever unknowingly repeated any of Vanessa's characterizations of me to other family members, without realizing their source. My mother-in-law, Diane, sent a single message, time-stamped at 10:07 p.m., that I've thought about many times since. "Vanessa, call me, now." Nothing else. No emoji, no explanation to the rest of the chat, just those 4 words. And I understood, reading them, that whatever Diane had just listened to had genuinely shaken her. Specifically, the claim that Vanessa had been quietly poisoning her against me for years. A claim Diane's own response suggested she'd never actually heard before in anything like this explicit form. Vanessa's own response, arriving about 20 minutes after the recording itself, was a single frantic message. "That was not meant for this chat. I'm so sorry. Please ignore that. It's taken out of context." I want to sit with that phrase, taken out of context, because I think it deserves scrutiny. There is no context, I've come to believe, in which describing your brother's wife as someone secretly trying to isolate him from his family while claiming to have been quietly undermining her to your own mother for years reads as anything other than exactly what it plainly was. Context doesn't transform betrayal into misunderstanding. It just gives people who want to look away from the plain meaning of something a place to hide. Theo called me from his work dinner within minutes of the recording landing, having received a flurry of texts from his siblings alerting him to check the group chat immediately. I want to describe that phone call in more detail because I think the specificity of Theo's reaction matters enormously to the eventual resolution of this story, and because I know some people, hearing a story like this, brace themselves for a spouse who minimizes or defends the family member instead. That was not what happened, and I want to honor that by describing it accurately. Theo's voice, when he called, had a shake to it I'd rarely heard, and he told me, before I could even fully process what he was saying, that he'd pulled over in the parking lot rather than driving while this upset, because he didn't trust himself behind the wheel in the state he was in. He asked me, directly, whether I was okay, before saying anything else at all about his sister. A small but significant ordering of priorities that I noticed even in the chaos of that first phone call, and that told me, immediately, which side of this he was going to land on. I want to describe his reaction because I think it matters enormously to how this story eventually resolved, and because I know some of you watching have wondered, in similar situations, whether a spouse will actually stand behind you once a family member's true feelings get exposed. Theo listened to the recording himself, standing in the parking lot outside his work dinner, and called me back within minutes, his voice tight with an anger I'd rarely heard from him in 6 years of marriage. "I need you to know I had no idea," he told me. "None of this. Not the holiday thing, not what she apparently told Mom. I'm coming home right now, and then I'm calling my sister, and I need you to know I am not going to pretend I didn't just hear what I heard." I want to describe the conversation between Theo and Vanessa that happened later that same night, because he relayed most of it to me afterward, and I think it matters to understanding how quickly the family dynamic actually shifted once the recording forced everyone's hand. He called her directly, rather than responding in the group chat, and told me later that she'd answered already crying, already in the middle of what he described as a kind of frantic, preemptive damage control, repeating variations of, "It's not what it sounded like," before he'd even finished saying hello. He told her, plainly, according to his own account, that he wasn't calling to discuss whether she was allowed to have complicated feelings about me, but to understand why she'd apparently been representing those feelings to their mother for years, as some kind of protective loyalty he'd never once heard about directly from Diane herself. He told me he'd never raised his voice with Vanessa in his entire life before that call. and that he did at one point that night, though he wasn't proud of it afterward, more out of shock at what he was hearing than any real loss of control. I want to describe the family reckoning that unfolded over the following weeks, because I think it's more interesting and more instructive than a simple story of one person's public humiliation. Before the formal family meeting, I want to describe the several days of near total silence in the group chat that preceded it, an eerie quiet from 31 people who had, only days earlier, been reacting in real time to the most dramatic thing most of them had ever witnessed unfold on that platform. I remember checking the chat obsessively during those days, half expecting some kind of continued fallout, and instead finding almost nothing, as though the entire family had collectively, silently agreed that whatever needed to happen next required an actual room rather than a screen. Diane, I later learned, had spent those days making individual phone calls to several family members privately, gathering her own understanding of the situation before deciding how she wanted to handle it as a matriarch, rather than simply reacting in the heat of the moment the way the rest of the family already had. Diane, Theo's mother, called a family meeting, an actual in-person gathering, not another group chat exchange, about 10 days after the recording, and I want to describe what she said at that meeting because it surprised me considerably given how close she and Vanessa had always seemed. Diane told the assembled family, with a directness I hadn't previously associated with her, that she had never, not once, heard anything resembling what Vanessa claimed to have been quietly telling her for years, and that if anything, she'd always found me to be one of the more genuinely engaged additions to the family, someone who remembered every grandchild's birthday and organized the family's annual reunion logistics more reliably than any of her own children ever had. I want to be very clear, Diane said, looking directly at Vanessa across the room, that you did not protect me from anything by keeping this to yourself all these years, because there was nothing to protect me from. You simply decided on your own that your version of Naomi was the true one, and you never once gave me the chance to disagree with you, because you never told me any of it directly until an accident forced your hand. I want to describe Vanessa's response to that confrontation because I think it reveals something important about how these situations often unfold once someone's private narrative gets forcibly exposed to the people it was built around. I want to describe the physical scene of that meeting a bit more because I think the setting itself carried its own quiet significance. Diane held it at her own house, in the same living room where the family had gathered for nearly every major holiday for as long as I'd been married into it, a room lined with photographs spanning decades, including several of Vanessa and me together at various family gatherings over the years, smiling in ways that now felt, to me, considerably more complicated to look at than they once had. I sat beside Theo, his hand tight around mine throughout, while Vanessa sat across the room beside her husband, who said almost nothing the entire meeting, his expression suggesting a man processing considerably more about his own marriage than he was prepared to discuss in front of his in-laws. She didn't apologize cleanly. She oscillated throughout that meeting between minimizing, "I was just venting, everyone vents to their sister," and doubling down, insisting that some of her specific grievances, however uncomfortably delivered, reflected genuine feelings she was entitled to have, even if the delivery had been inappropriate. I want to be fair here and acknowledge that Vanessa wasn't entirely wrong about that narrow point. Everyone is entitled to complicated feelings about in-laws, and venting to a trusted sister is not, on its own, some unforgivable sin. What made this situation different, what made it a genuine betrayal rather than simple private venting, was the specific claim that she'd been actively managing her mother's perception of me for years, behind my back, without my knowledge, using language specifically designed to make me sound dangerous to the family's cohesion, rather than simply someone she personally didn't click with. I want to describe one particular exchange from that meeting that I think crystallized the entire dynamic more than anything else said that evening. Theo's brother Marcus, uncharacteristically direct, for someone usually content to stay quiet during family conflict, asked Vanessa a single pointed question. Did you ever, one single time in 6 years, tell Naomi directly that something she did bothered you? Vanessa was quiet for a long moment before admitting, quietly, that she hadn't. Not really. Not in any way that went beyond surface level politeness. Marcus's response has stayed with me since. Then I don't think this was ever really about Naomi doing something wrong. I think this was about you deciding, a long time ago, that you didn't want to like her, and building a case to justify that decision instead of ever just being honest with her, or with Mom, or with any of us. The most significant fallout from that meeting, and the part of this story I think matters most beyond the initial shock of the recording itself, was what happened to Vanessa's relationship with her own mother in the months that followed. Diane, I would learn through Theo, spent weeks processing not just what Vanessa had said about me, but the more unsettling realization that her daughter had apparently been comfortable representing herself, for years, as someone bringing Diane concerns quietly, a framing that implied a kind of protective loyalty Diane had never actually asked for, and once she understood its actual content, didn't want. Diane told Theo, in a private conversation he later shared with me, that she felt Vanessa had used her, in a sense, as a kind of imagined ally in a private grievance campaign, without ever actually checking whether Diane agreed with any of it, and that this realization bothered her considerably more than any individual complaint Vanessa had voiced about me. I want to be honest about my own emotional experience during this entire period, because I think it's more complicated than pure vindication, however satisfying certain parts of it genuinely were. I want to describe a specific moment from a few weeks after the family meeting that captures this complexity better than a general summary could. I was at the grocery store, reaching for a specific brand of pasta sauce, when I suddenly remembered, with total clarity, a moment from 3 years earlier, a holiday gathering where Vanessa had commented, lightly, on my choice to serve a store-bought dessert rather than baking one myself, a comment I'd taken, at the time, as harmless small talk. Standing in that grocery aisle, I found myself suddenly recalculating that entire memory, wondering whether it had been genuinely offhand or whether it had been another small entry in whatever mental ledger Vanessa had apparently been keeping about me for years. I stood there for a strange, disorienting minute, pasta sauce in hand, before making myself put it down and simply finish my shopping, recognizing, even as it happened, that I was doing exactly the kind of retroactive forensic reconstruction of memory that I'd have to learn to manage if I didn't want this entire ordeal to permanently color every recollection I had of 6 years of family life. Hearing that recording hurt in a way that lingered considerably longer than the initial 2 hours of shock. Even once Diane and Theo and most of the rest of the family had made clear, unambiguously, that they didn't share Vanessa's characterization of me, some part of me couldn't fully shake the unsettling knowledge that someone I'd shared a family with for 6 years had been quietly constructing that characterization the entire time, filing away ordinary moments and reshaping them into evidence for a case I never knew was being built against me. That kind of discovery changes how you experience your own memories of a relationship, even after the immediate crisis resolves. I found myself, for months afterward, unconsciously reviewing old interactions with Vanessa, wondering which ones might have been cataloged the same way, a specific, low-grade paranoia that took real time and eventually real therapy to work through. I want to mention the therapy specifically, because I think it's worth naming directly rather than glossing over. I started seeing a therapist about 6 weeks after the incident, initially intending to address what felt, at the time, like a fairly contained issue, processing the shock of the recording itself. What actually emerged over several months of sessions was something broader, a pattern of low-grade self-doubt I hadn't fully recognized in myself before, a tendency, going back well before I ever met Theo's family, to assume that other people's coolness toward me reflected some genuine flaw in myself rather than simply being about them. Working through that pattern, with real professional support, ended up mattering as much to my actual recovery from this entire ordeal as anything that happened within the family itself. And I mention it because I think it's an honest, useful detail for anyone watching who's gone through something similar. Sometimes the most important repair work happens somewhere other than the relationship that caused the initial wound. I want to describe where things actually landed, because I think the resolution here is messier and more honest than a clean, triumphant ending would be. Vanessa and I have not repaired our relationship, not in any meaningful sense, in the year and a half since. We attend the same family gatherings, exchange the necessary pleasantries, and maintain a careful, functional distance that neither of us has tried particularly hard to close. I want to describe one final interaction with Vanessa before I close this out, because I think it's the most honest note I can end our specific relationship on. About a year after the incident, at a family barbecue, we found ourselves alone together briefly in the kitchen, both reaching for the same serving spoon. She said quietly, without quite meeting my eyes, "I don't expect you to ever fully forgive me. I just want you to know I've thought about that recording almost every day since it happened, and not because of how embarrassing it was for me, but because I finally had to hear, out loud, exactly what I actually sounded like when I let myself say the worst version of my thoughts without any filter. That's a hard thing to sit with about yourself." I didn't offer her easy absolution in that moment, because I didn't feel it. And I've never believed in performing forgiveness I don't genuinely feel simply to smooth over an awkward family gathering. But I told her I appreciated her saying that honestly, and that I hoped, whatever came next for both of us, it involved considerably more direct conversation and considerably less quiet cataloging. She nodded, and we finished serving the potato salad in a silence that felt, for the first time in over a year, less hostile than simply honest. I don't think either of us wants to pretend, at this point, that we're likely to become close, and I've made a kind of peace with that outcome that surprises me, honestly, given how devastating that initial recording felt. What did change, meaningfully, was my relationship with Diane, who has, in the time since, made a series of small, deliberate gestures that I've come to understand as her own way of actively repairing something she felt her silence had allowed to fester unnecessarily for years. I want to describe one specific gesture from Diane that meant more to me than almost anything else that happened in the aftermath. About 3 months after the incident, without any prompting from me or from Theo, she asked if she could come along to one of my son's school events, something she'd never specifically requested before, always simply attending whichever family gatherings naturally included the grandchildren, rather than making a point of showing up for something that was, in a sense, more specifically part of my own daily life, rather than a broader family occasion. She sat beside me the entire time, asked genuine questions about my son's teacher and his friends, and told me afterward, over coffee, that she wanted to start actually knowing the details of my life directly from me, rather than continuing to receive secondhand impressions filtered through anyone else in the family, a comment I understood, immediately, as a direct, deliberate correction of exactly the dynamic that had allowed Vanessa's narrative to exist unchallenged for so long. She started calling me directly, rather than only through Theo, to check in about things, a habit she'd apparently maintained with her other daughters-in-law for years, but had, for reasons neither of us has fully unpacked, never quite extended to me in the same way before all of this happened. She told me, about 6 months after the incident, over coffee she'd specifically invited me to alone, that she felt genuinely embarrassed realizing how much space she'd unknowingly left for Vanessa's narrative to exist unchallenged, simply because she'd never had a direct enough relationship with me to form her own clear impression independent of what her daughter told her. "I let her be the only voice telling me who you were," Diane told me, "and that was my mistake to fix, not just hers to apologize for." I want to mention one more detail before I close this out, because it's the small, almost absurd coda to this entire story that I still find myself laughing about, even now. Before I get to Priscilla's message, I want to describe the strange, lingering awkwardness that settled over family gatherings for the first several months after the incident, because I think it's a more honest depiction of the aftermath than a story that jumps straight from confrontation to resolution. Holidays became noticeably more choreographed for a while. Diane, I noticed, began subtly managing seating arrangements to keep Vanessa and me at a comfortable distance without ever making it look deliberate. And conversations at these gatherings had a slightly careful, monitored quality that hadn't existed before, as though the whole family was collectively still finding its new equilibrium. I don't think that awkwardness was a bad thing exactly. I think it reflected a family genuinely recalibrating something that had been quietly broken for years without most of them realizing it. And I've come to believe that a certain amount of visible discomfort is simply the honest cost of a family actually reckoning with something, rather than performing a quick, superficial piece that leaves the underlying problem untouched. About 2 months after the incident, Vanessa's sister Priscilla, the actual intended recipient of that 11-minute recording, reached out to me directly, entirely unprompted, mortified on my behalf, and, I think, genuinely trying to make some kind of amends for her own role, however unwitting, as the audience Vanessa had originally been performing for. She told me, somewhat sheepishly, that she'd actually pushed back on several of Vanessa's characterizations of me during their private conversations over the years, gently disagreeing more than once with the version of events Vanessa presented, and that she wanted me to know that not everyone who'd heard Vanessa's private complaints over the years had simply accepted them uncritically. I appreciated that gesture more than I expected to, honestly, a small, unlooked-for piece of evidence that even within Vanessa's own chosen confidant, her narrative about me had never been quite as universally accepted as that 11-minute recording made it sound in the moment. I want to describe my actual conversation with Priscilla in a bit more detail because it added an unexpected layer of context I hadn't previously had. She told me that she'd found herself, more than once over the years, gently telling Vanessa that some of her interpretations of my behavior seemed like a stretch, that she genuinely liked me during the times they'd interacted directly at family gatherings, and that she'd sometimes wondered, privately, whether Vanessa's feelings about me had less to do with anything I'd actually done and more to do with some older, unresolved dynamic between Vanessa and their own mother. A pattern of feeling like the overlooked older daughter that had apparently predated my arrival into the family by years. I don't know how much weight to give that theory, and Priscilla was careful to say she wasn't trying to excuse anything Vanessa had done, only to offer whatever context might help me understand it. I've held on to that conversation since, not because it changed how I feel about what Vanessa did, but because it offered a small, human explanation underneath the cruelty, the same kind of underlying grief and unresolved history that seems to run through so many family betrayals like this one, once you're finally given enough context to see it clearly. I think, in the end, about the specific, almost accidental mercy of technology's occasional carelessness, the same kind of accident that's run through several stories on this channel. A wrong number at a bank, a firmware update that didn't delete old security footage, and now, a voice memo sent to the wrong thread. I want to end with a small reflection on what this entire ordeal ultimately taught me about how families actually function or fail to underneath the surface of holiday gatherings and group chat pleasantries. For 6 years, I'd measured my belonging in that family by the visible markers I could see and control: showing up, contributing, remembering birthdays, organizing reunions. What that recording taught me, painfully but I think ultimately usefully, is that belonging in a family isn't only built by what you do. It's also shaped by conversations you're never present for, narratives constructed about you by people who never give you the chance to respond, and the willingness, or unwillingness, of the people around you to actually investigate those narratives rather than simply absorbing them. I got lucky, in a strange, specific way, that Vanessa's narrative happened to escape its intended container loudly enough and publicly enough that the rest of the family couldn't avoid confronting it directly. Most people who are quietly undermined within their own families never get that accidental mercy. Their story simply calcifies, unchallenged, in the private conversations they're never invited to hear. I don't think Vanessa's private feelings about me would have ever surfaced on their own, absent that specific mundane mistake of tapping the wrong contact in a messaging app late at night. I've thought about that a great deal since. How much of what actually gets corrected in families depends not on anyone's deliberate courage to speak difficult truths directly, but on the sheer, unplanned accident of a truth escaping its intended container before anyone was ready for it to. That's my story. My sister-in-law accidentally sent our entire 31-person family group chat an 11-minute recording of herself trashing me to her sister, revealing a years-long quiet campaign to turn my mother-in-law against me that I never once suspected existed. If you've ever discovered, by accident or otherwise, that someone had been building a private case against you behind your back, I want you to hear this clearly. The truth doesn't need your permission to eventually surface, and the people who genuinely know you rarely need much convincing once it finally does. If this story made you gasp or laugh or both, subscribe to True Family Drama. Tell me in the comments about the most chaotic wrong chat moment you've ever witnessed, and I'll see you in the next one.